Behold, my glorious supporter Mocharaid has requested my top build crafting games. Well, specifically, you said, for my parlay question, what are your top 5 games for Buildcraft, and can you briefly go into why for each? Top 5? What are you doing there? That sounds to me like a favorites question incognito. Very clever, Mocharaid, but I will not fall for such a... No, I'm just kidding. I'll give you 5. But in no particular order, and I don't necessarily think that these are the ones I think are the 5 best. I'm going to give you 5 that I think are very good. Because I didn't prepare for this question before answering it, I think that this probably is my, subconsciously top 5, as close as I can get. But exactly in what order, I do not know. Let's start with the obvious one, Warframe. Okay, Jan, you know, why is Warframe a good game for making builds? What's going to be interesting about answering this question is explaining why, because I think most of you can probably guess the games I'm going to say, or at least quite a few of them, 3 of them. But why? What is it about it? Warframe. So the first thing is that one of the things that's very important to me in a build crafting game is that if there are elements, they're good somewhere. Warframe isn't perfect at this, but there are parts of Warframe that are exemplary at this. It is rare to see a game that has so many characters, or Warframes in this case, that are all very good. Now, it's not only because the game is really easy. They really are all pretty good. They have different strengths. The ones that don't have exciting abilities are very few, and they are tanky, and they have abilities, Warframe does a very good job of providing different options for people who want different things. If you don't want to focus on abilities and you'd rather focus on weapons, you can do that, and we'll get to how good Warframe is at that in a second. If you want to focus on more linear abilities or a more generalist frame, or you really like a specific niche, or you want something totally different from everything else, Warframe is really good at that stuff. There are a lot of different options, and all of those playstyles are fit very well into Warframe. This is not true of a lot of games. Second thing is that Warframe has a very good, I guess I would call economy of choice. There aren't a lot of choices in the game that don't matter. Now you might be thinking, well, modding, there's a lot of mandatory mods. Yeah, but at the same time, there aren't very many mod slots. And so you make choices. You don't spend forever on a million choices that add up to something meaningful. You put on one mod and it makes a meaningful difference. Now, I'm right there with you if you're saying, oh, well, but I want more variety in the mods. Just look at Melee 3.0 as an example of how there really aren't mandatory mods. You really do pick something for every slot. Now, within each slot, there aren't always a lot of choices. If your weapon is a heavy attack weapon and it hits one time and you're not going to give it status elsewhere, then you pretty much use prime pressure point. If your weapon hits rapidly and it has literally nothing status chance, and even if it does, it might have force procs in the stance, you're pretty much using condition overload. That being said, you do have a choice between those two. You could use both of them, etc. So even in its worst moments with like base damage mods, Warframe still has pretty good economy of choice, in that at least that mod makes a big difference as you progress through the game. So that's cool. Warframe has a very large number of weapons. They're all pretty unique. They look cool. They have different sound effects. They're nice sound effects, and they're almost all good. Now, a thing I love to say in Warframe is how usually the best variant or a superior variant of a weapon is almost always good. So maybe the Cernos isn't that good, but there are a lot of advanced variants of it that are very good. Maybe the Boltor is not that good, but the Telos Boltor is good, etc. Right? And so if you like a weapon, it's very rare that you can't use it at higher levels of play, which is really good. That's admirable for a game with so many weapons, right? So that's really good. The modularity of the loadout system, how your builds can increasingly talk to each other, how you can use slots in your Warframe to make your weapons more powerful, occasionally your weapons to make your Warframe more powerful. Sometimes you can have something that doesn't do much for you itself, but has some kind of benefit for the rest of your loadout. Set mods are the beginning of something that could be developed more and be really good. Companions, I think companion balance is a highlight of Warframe. There are a lot of companions, and they're pretty much all useful if in some situation if you want to use them. And yet there are still good generalists, but they're not such good generalists that they invalidate more niche companions. That, right? These are all really awesome qualities. These are all things that mean that if you want to think about what you want to use, or look for synergy, or just make your own playstyle that's distinct to you, even if you don't like exactly what I like about Buildcraft, it's pretty hard to imagine that if you like customizing your gameplay, you're somehow not going to like Warframe as long as you like other stuff about it, like the way the gameplay feels and such, right? So I think that's a good answer for why is Warframe my, not my top, but one of the really good Buildcrafty games I've played. Hades is probably the more obvious one. What's so good about Hades? What I like about Hades is similar in that it does this thing where you get the amount of choice you want. If you don't care about having choices, you can remove them. And I don't think I've ever played a game where choice and making a deliberate build can be done with such agency, but in the same game, you can have a very good experience if you remove or do not use that agency. In other words, if you play Hades much more like a roguelike, rather than a game where you have, it's a roguelite in the most extreme sense and you pretty much have control of what you get, both of those games are really good, like, and well balanced, you know? That's phenomenal. How even? That's weird. Hades is really well balanced. There are a lot of things that are very, very good. Even the things that are maybe really, really good are usually good because of synergy, and you do have to plan them out. Things that are trivializing are very hard to get because there's a risk there. That's cool. They're not afraid of putting things in that are just absurd levels of power, but it's a risk to try to get them. Yet there are plenty of things that are very good, powerful enough to clear the game with, that you can get very reliably if you so choose. That's really cool. Really cleverly blending story with buildcraft. A lot of these games that have buildcrafty stuff tend to be a little caught up in it, and I get that. It takes a lot of work to make something good. And the other elements of the game kind of suffer. Warframe is a really good example of this. Yes, there's this mountain of buildcraft toys, but there isn't really a lot of places to use them, you know? And Warframe's story is, I think, sometimes fantastic, but really inconsistent, right? Hades is pretty much phenomenal at everything it attempts. It is such a polished game in so many other ways, and that you might be saying that doesn't have anything to do with Buildcraft, you're just reviewing the game, but it does, because Buildcraft is the practice of customizing your gameplay experience and your primary gameplay loop. And that only feels really good if the game is good. Like if you want to do the primary gameplay loop in the game. And in Hades, I would argue you do. It's very hard not to like if you are at all interested in any of the things it has to offer. I can totally see people not liking Hades, but if you want the things that it's trying to do, it's so good at those things, I would argue. And that's why. So for Hades, it's something, the main thing is that it does a exemplary, I don't think I've ever played a game that does a better job of, you technically can't deliberately pick exactly what you get, but the game does such a good job giving you enormous, almost perfect agency, to the point that if you want a specific build, you need to engage with the way that the game is willing to let you have it, but you can reliably get that. It's very good at something that I don't have a good name for yet. This is a question we could revisit sometime in like a year when I have good words for all these things, but it's really good for if you want to try a build, you can usually try it pretty quick because the runs are pretty snappy. The god keepsakes and re-rolling boon choices and thinning out the boon pool and all this stuff give you a lot of agency if you want it when choosing a boon, but then if you don't want it, that game is also good, and you can have this purely emergent buildcraft or buildcraft that is largely based on your agency. And having both of those in the same game is insane. Being able to have a little bit of both, have a full experience of intending a build, but then there's also emergent buildcraft in there. That's really cool. The other little thing that I think I'm giving Hades some credit for is adding in buildcraft for things that are a little unusual to be able to buildcraft. It's interesting how Hades has the boon system, then your weapons, you pick a weapon, the boon system. But that's really not that different from what a lot of games have. A lot of games that have some build craftiness in them, roguelites in particular, that's not unusual. What's a little more unusual is the Mirror of Night, Pact of Punishment duality, where you can inherently make the game less hard in certain ways, and or more hard in certain ways. And buildcraft, the difficulty is strange. Like, it's not just that you can turn up and down the difficulty. You can turn up and down different parts of the difficulty. You could deliberately make it harder quicker, or try to get the most heat on the Pact of Punishment while putting on modifiers that make the game harder, but in a way that your build will have the least possible trouble with. Stuff like that. That's fascinating and a really unique situation for the game, for the game's buildcraft overall, that I haven't really experienced in other games. It's really interesting. A very cool idea. Finally, I think that Hades does a really good job with difficulty. This is connected to all this stuff, but I feel like approaching the game where at the beginning it's just wicked hard, and then it kind of has an easy mode, but you basically have to unlock it. That's quite clever. A lot of people better versed than me in reviewing video games in their entirety have said it that way, that Hades kind of involves you earn the easy mode. And so you get this experience of, it's really hard, but the way the game's narrative is structured, it's okay to die and have it be too hard. But then you make it easier in a way that feels like you're learning, and lets you make it like even more easier if you want to. And then if it gets too easy, then you unlock the ability to make it harder again. This is very elegant. So Hades. Third one is going to be Genshin Impact. This game does an exemplary job of its economy of elements, even better than Warframe or almost most other games I've played, where describing your build is very, very simple. It's very easy. There are not very many parts to the character's build. You can just say, you know, my albedo is Harbinger of Dawn, 2-piece Guardian, 2-piece Archaic Petra. My stats for Cup, Clock, Cup, and Crown are Defense, Geo Damage, and Critical Chance, I think. And the Defender's pieces are 4 stars, so I put those on my Flower and Feather. Done. And that's like a more complicated than usual build. You know, you could do Kuching, Electro Kuching, the Flute, 4-piece Thunder Soother, Attack, Electro Damage, Critical Chance. Done. That's the build. And yet the build systems are very interesting. You can make builds that are a lot more complicated, and the reason for those builds could be really interesting, but the game is quite clear about what the elements are. It's not like there's a whole bunch of stuff going on behind the scenes that you somehow don't know. It's quite crisp in that way. It's very clean, I think. And yet it is not simple. The way Genshin Impact is structured is around having those 4 characters to swap between, and having that kind of system means that you can very carefully buildcraft a team out of simple elements that are all individually very easy to understand, but then exactly how you would apply them is fascinating. There's a lot of, in Genshin Impact, a really odd kind of buildcraft where it's kind of rotation buildcraft. If you've played older MMOs like World of Warcraft, you might be familiar with the idea of a rotation. And this is the idea that you want to use your skills, you know, use this skill every 5 seconds. In between that, you're going to have time for this, and every other rotation, this one, and the rotation after that, this one, and you'll just click those buttons and whatever. No offense if you like that. I think that's really boring. What's interesting in Genshin Impact is that it's this action-based combat where you need to move around a lot, and you are interested in what elements are on the enemies, but you also want to swap between your characters to get value out of them. You might have a character that is rewarding you for keeping them on the field for a long time, but then you're sacrificing being able to have other characters pumping out their stuff, or characters that leave it all on the field when they swap off, and then you can combine them into this Voltron character that has like 4 different effects going off at the same time. You can measure the benefits and detriments of those things. You might want to avoid a character that has a certain element while you react for this other element. Oh, fortuitously, this element got spread to that other enemy, so now I want to swap to this character. And oh, this ability is up, but I have to weigh the benefit of using this other character who could swirl this element over there, so that when I use that ability, I get it off there, versus having the cooldown back up sooner. And that's really interesting. Yet the elements are very simple. It's not like there's a ton of different abilities. Across your whole team, you have 4 skills and 4 bursts, so you have 8 abilities. It's not overwhelming, I don't think. And yet it doesn't take a lot to start stringing together some cool combos between abilities. I think the elemental system is pretty elegant. I think the interesting way that you can kind of It has this game design I really like where you can sort of trivialize an element of the game if you want. If you don't want to have to worry about, let's say, oh, what's a good example? This would be, shields. You can focus a team on breaking down enemy shields, or you just hate the small enemies, you want to get them out of the way. You'd rather fight a bunch of small enemies, you'd rather fight one big enemy. You can build your team that way. But it also has things like, in the open world, you just don't want to worry about the burnt grass, so you build another combo. Pyro is good, but it's not the be-all, end-all. Things like that. I feel like the elements have their own identity in interesting ways. Each different element cares about other elements to varying degrees in ways that I think are really interesting. We don't even have Dendro, the seventh element, as a playable for you element. I hope we will, and I wonder what its elemental reactions will be. But anyway, the ones we have are really interesting. That stuff is all really cool. Genshin Impact is also a game where gacha games, or games with a gacha economy in them, where you have to randomly roll for characters. These games tend to be at least a little interesting for Buildcraft because the game is built around the premise that there's a ton of characters. The problem usually is that you have no agency in acquiring those characters. For all you know, you will just never get the character, right? And that's not financially responsible or morally acceptable, as well as just being unfortunate for the player. They feel like they have to gamble to get the Buildcraft tools on the table. And so this might not seem related to Buildcraft, but what I think Genshin Impact does very well is allowing the player an acceptable level of control over what they get in that primary monetization system. Having pity, hard pity and soft pity for 5-star characters, meaning that if you want a character on a banner, you can, under certain circumstances, be positive that you will get them, and giving away 4-star characters in the shop for a currency that you can readily get, meaning that every so often you can just guaranteed acquire a certain character. Means that you can work toward having the roster you want without there being a chance that you will just get unlucky and never ever get it. That feels really good. I also really like that this game, unlike some other games, doesn't just give you a free character during some events. It gives you one of the existing characters for free, not just a new limited character, but a character that you may have already wanted will suddenly be available for free for a limited time. That is a nice gesture, and I think a wholesome way to do it. Relying on characters that people simply want rather than characters they feel like they need. It's very important for these games to have good balance. And another thing Genshin Impact does really well, that a lot of these games have done well, that I care about a lot, is that the balance is pretty impressive for a game like this. They've even done this clever, kind of sinister, but sort of clever thing where the starting characters you get given appear to be pretty bad, like not useless or anything, but certainly worse than most, if not all, of the other characters. And yet later on, you realize that no, actually, at least a few of them are pretty good. And they did make sure to give each of these characters unique strengths that you may or may not want. You might not like those things, but they certainly are very good at something. And I love this feeling in this game where when you think about a certain element of a character, you can really feel the developers having carefully thought about that decision. You don't always agree, but you often feel like, oh, I mean, if I loved this character, there would be this you could do with them, Just wondering, you think to yourself, what if I wanted to use this purely healer character as an attacking character? And the developers say, well, that's stupid, and you're stupid, but we respect that. And this character does have this one weird strength that you could try to leverage, which is cool. I just think that's nice. It seems like the developers had fun coming up with what all these characters will do, and I'm looking forward to there being more of them. In fact, the only thing I don't absolutely love about Genshin Impact is that there aren't more 4-star characters for me to get. I have all of them. I don't have all the 5-star characters, of course, but as a very low-spending player in that game, I have, and it's possible to get all of the 4-star characters that are, they're not limited. And having that many build options on the table is really cool. So yeah, Genshin Impact, definitely different strengths than some other games, but yeah, it's interesting. Just a final note there. Some games like Warframe do this thing where they have a lot of different multipliers, and you need to leverage multiplying the different multipliers. The game is kind of about making the mental breakthrough that you can combine these multipliers in a different way to make a weapon many tens of times stronger than it was before. There are games like Hades that focus really strongly on not distinct separate multipliers. Hades is not a game about having this one attack that you make just do more raw damage with several different multipliers. Hades is much more about using different tools in your kit and turning them into pseudo separate multipliers that work together. You can add damage to stuff, but it's not about multiplying that one damage value. I'm not saying either way is better or worse, but they're different, and that's interesting. Genshin Impact I really like because it does a very good job of combining both of those things. You do need to leverage separate multipliers, and because there are only a few of them, and the game has very few elements in your build, you only have a weapon and 5 artifacts. When you add a stat to your build, there aren't that many multipliers, and you don't have that many things to get multipliers from. So when you add something to your build, you get a lot of that thing, and you really notice the difference. And at the same time, the true heights of the game's damage can only be reached by just going absolutely over the top with the way that the game lets you use different abilities to interact. You need to sort of invent more multipliers and combine into this gigantic Voltron where all 4 characters are this long combo that you sequence and then you get this absurdly huge damage number, or that you combine into all these smaller but very numerous large damage numbers. And that way of playing is really interesting. Of course, you can also have characters where you build the whole team around them and they do all the damage. The other characters are there to support them or to enable them or to keep the engine going. And you have to stack up just a crazy amount of effects on this one character's one ability to get that one spicy hit. I'm talking about Noelle if you play Genshin Impact. But there are lots of characters like that. I think that's really cool. I think combining those two things, I really like the many multipliers thing about Warframe. I really like the you can't just fall back on multipliers thing in Hades, and I like how Genshin Impact combines those two things. There are 2 games left. Now, I answered the 3 that you probably knew I was going to answer, and now we'll answer some that you probably didn't think I was going to answer. And when I say you probably didn't think I was going to answer these games, what I mean is I don't know what these games are. So let's open up my Steam library and look from there. There are games, I'll make an honorable mention for games like Risk of Rain 2 that don't really have buildcraft, but they have a very interesting relationship with not having buildcraft, where they kind of appear to, but then secretly don't, and you sort of go from there. Risk of Rain 2 is a roguelike, a pretty pure roguelike, I would argue. And it has a setting where whenever you get an item drop, you get to pick what item you get. Oh, so the game has buildcraft, you might be thinking. Well, but it doesn't though, because every item in the game basically just combos into everything else. And so you can take different approaches, but they don't lead, not in a meaningful way. They lead to the same outcome. It's not like a completely different play style, which is fine. That's not what the game is about. It's just, I found that very interesting. As somebody who talks about builds for a living, Risk of Rain 2 is one of the most interesting games I've yet encountered for how it isn't a buildcrafty game, but has this very specific relationship with that. Disco Elysium is probably the 4th game I'm going to mention. This is a game that, so you might be thinking, what top 5 games for buildcraft. The reason for this one is not because the game itself is something that if you love making builds and that's it, you should go play this game. No, I don't think you should. I think that you would be very interested in this game. I think that you won't enjoy it for its raw build craftiness, but I really wish that a game that cared more about its buildcraft used the systems that this game has, because they're very cool and they would be really interesting in a game that had different consequences. Disco Elysium has this build crafting sort of gambit where every stat that you can get in your sort of traditional RPG, build your character to have like 3 dexterity and 2 endurance and 5 esprit de corps, which is a stat in the game that means like knowledge of the police, like understanding police stuff. 7 electrochemistry, that's drug use. These stats that make you not exactly good at a thing. They make you biased toward that thing. And so if you have a lot of electrochemistry, you can get more uses out of cigarettes and alcohol, and you can gain more benefits from using drugs, but you also get more detriments from using drugs. Electrochemistry is also like horniness. And so I had a disgusting but humorous encounter where I had really high I was doing an electrochemistry focused playthrough, and my character saw like a cigarette or something in like a waste barrel. As I was walking down the street, the game stopped me and popped up a dialogue thing and was like, "Oh, there's like some blunts in that waste barrel or whatever." And your character just like gets horny, and the other parts of your imagination are just like chiming in to say, "Oh, we should just get naked right here and start getting off." And you think, "But no, stop, like focus." But no, you built the character to be focused on this thing. You did this. This is your fault, player. Which is interesting. Or another one is there's endurance, which is your health, but it makes you interpret the world through the lens of like, I can take it, but you can't. Like, that doesn't make you actually necessarily stronger. It just means you sort of have the statement of will that you can endure it, you know. And so a character is going to punch you, and the endurance goes, "Oh, you're gonna be fine. Like, take it right on the chin." Like, no, don't. Like, you're gonna black out. Stop. And that way that the different voices chime in different ways. At the beginning of the game, this is a tiny spoiler. If you have a lot of inland empire, which is kind of like your imagination or your subconscious going a bit wild, fears in the back of your head or a voice from somewhere else speaking to you, overactive imagination, you might say. There's a thing where you're passed out drunk and you're gonna go look in the mirror and you realize that you like don't know what your face looks like, but you do, but you're a little bit drunk, so whatever. And the Inland Empire voice, if you have a lot of it, will chime in and say, "Whoa, don't look in the mirror. There might be something really freaky in there." And it's like, dude, you could just look in the mirror. It's fine. But you don't know, you know, like for all you know, I mean, again, I won't spoil what happens, but like, it's not that simple. But you're thinking it's just looking in a mirror. It's fine, right? Who do you believe? I don't know. You specked into having an overactive imagination. So this is a very different kind of buildcraft that I enjoy because it doesn't have anything to do with combat. I wish there was a game that had this that did have to do with combat, but it doesn't. It's not about that. How you apply the buildcraft is not really what's interesting. What's interesting to me is how the game asks you to make decisions for a very different reason than you would normally, and how it punishes you for decisions you make in, again, like a very different way. It's sort of like when you make a wish on a genie in a lamp, and you say, "Oh, I want all the money in the world." And the genie says, "All right, wish granted." And all the money in the world falls on top of you and you get crushed and die. You asked for all the money in the world, player. It's not my fault, you know? And I like that. I like that the game says, "Are you sure you want this? Like, really? Are you sure?" And has this interesting way in which specializing is carefully metered. There's a very careful balance to specializing. Cool. Finally, I'm going to talk about Magic the Gathering. This is a hard one. It's very difficult to discuss what I think is good about this game. So let's try. Magic the Gathering is an interesting build crafting game, first of all, because of the format for the build crafting. Deck building games are interesting in ways that you don't always appreciate at a low level of play when you're thinking about the space you have available. Rather than having an economy of space, these deck building games usually kind of do the reverse, where rather than saying you have this limited space, you know, do what you can with it, they often are designed so that you have too much space. You'd rather have less space in your deck, but you can't. You have to have a minimum of 60 cards. And so you want a maximum of 60 cards, really, because you want to draw the cards you want to get the most of the time, with a few exceptions. And so the game kind of makes you figure out, you know, what do I do with that space? For example, a type of strategy I've played a lot of in my time playing Magic, which has been pretty much my entire life, is a ramp strategy. This is a strategy where you build up the amount of resources, mana, that you have, and play larger threats, creatures or spells, early by increasing with some other spells how much mana you have available. And A really powerful version of a ramp strategy is one where you have these creatures in the green color, which is themed around making mana and having huge creatures that are called mana dorks. They're 1 mana creatures. You can play them on turn 1, and they can make you more mana. Not right away, but eventually, if they're not killed. My favorite saying in Magic is Bolt the Bird, which means cast Lightning Bolt targeting Birds of Paradise, which is a 1 mana red spell that kills a 1 mana green mana dork creature called Birds of Paradise. And new players often think, oh, well, but it's not a threat. And it's like, well, yes, but it might as well be. If you kill it, there won't be a bigger threat. And that breakthrough is interesting to me. But anyway, back to the ramp thing. You would love it if you could play in a format where, oh, there's one mana green creature that produces mana. There's a mana dork. Cool. I'm going to play ramp. But, oh, it's not that simple because there's only one. So you can't make a 60 card deck with 4. You can put 4 of a card in your deck. You can't just put 4 of that card in and reliably get it. Statistics say you need about 9 if you want to get 1 every opening hand of 7 cards out of your 60 card deck. So if there's only 4, can you play that strategy? Well, it's frequently been good in the past. And oftentimes what will happen is, okay, well, on turn 1, I want to play a mana dork. I have 4 of them in there. I'm okay, a little bit less than 50% chance that I'll draw 1. If I don't draw 1, then I have some other lands in the deck that I can play my land for turn, like always, but this one comes into play tapped, so I can't use it right away. But it has some other benefit. I can scry and manipulate the top card of my library, and then I'm kind of accomplishing something that turn, hopefully getting myself closer to consistently having a threat to deploy once I eventually ramp up my mana. And then I have this 2 mana creature that can accelerate my mana, or this 3 mana spell that accelerates my mana. So if I miss it on turn 1, the deck has kind of like a dual modal thing going on where there are multiple different strategies that have to combine to make a cohesive result where eventually on turn 5 you have a big creature in play, but you can't always do it the same way a lot of the time, or sometimes you can, and then there are consequences to that because people start to know, oh, that's the deck that every turn 1 they play a mana dork, so I'm going to start playing the anyway. So Magic has a really interesting metagaming aspect because of that, but what I find really interesting is how most of the time that you make a good deck in Magic the Gathering, you have to really carefully think about what are the consequences of using this one way to ramp my creature into play, where I play a mana dork on turn 1. What do I do if I'm waiting till turn 5? My creature's like 6 or 7 mana or something. What do I do in the meantime? My other accelerators are not necessarily as useful because I already have one, but I have just this mana dork. What else do I play in that time? Well, I have a mana dork, and I'm planning to play something big on turn 5 that costs 6 mana. On turn 2, I'll have 3 mana. Maybe I could play an aggressive 3 mana creature to kind of hold my opponent off. Okay, but what if you don't get the mana dork on turn 1? Then on turn 2, you're going to have this accelerator, and then on turn 4, you have 5 mana, but you don't have anything that's 5 mana. And it doesn't line up perfectly, right? And so you have to figure out a way to sort of finagle your deck together to have synergy, but also to hedge its bets on exactly how much you're relying on that sequence of cards and what the sort of worst case scenario is as well. And thinking about all the different combinations of cards and what they would mean is what makes the game so complicated and interesting, I think. That's cool. There's lots of other things to say about Magic, but that kind of complicated thing is what I find really interesting about deck building. I like Magic because it's a game where your mechanical skill at the game, that is how well you know how to outplay your opponent and respond to their cards, and you've studied the metagame and you know every single card in standard and whatever, is kind of counterbalanced by if you build a very good deck, you can kind of make up for some of that information. And at a medium level of play, Magic is an expressive game where you can be a different kind of player. You can play basic cards but very clearly understand what your opponent's trying to do and dismantle it, or you can play a very complicated, clever, intricate strategy with maybe not as strong an understanding of what your opponent is doing. Now, obviously, both are very important. As somebody who played briefly at a tournament level, I'm keenly aware that I am inadequate at some parts of the game and rely too heavily on other parts of the game. But the fact that you can do that is kind of interesting. The fact that you can focus on your own strategy or disrupting your opponent, or you're a little bit more interested in the deck building itself, is cool. I like that. And there are lots of other things. There's thinking about mulliganing. That is, if you don't draw a hand that you like, you kind of draw a new hand with one less card, and how you can manipulate that to maybe be in your favor. There are decks that might mulligan really well versus decks that don't. How to decide what hand to keep. And these are buildcrafty things because you design the deck. You think, well, this is an aggressive deck. What happens if I draw too much land? I have mostly creatures that don't cost much to play. So what if I draw too much land? What do I do? What is the strategy's solution? And then you can think about that. You can hedge your bets and say, well, I guess I'll just keep lands with one less land, hands with one less land in them, lands with one less hand in them. There you go. Or you could find a way to, this land is a little slower, but it has an ability I can use if I draw too much land that could help me win later on. Or I'm going to be more aggressive, but then I have less reach. If my opponent slows me down, then I can't finish them off, but it's harder to slow me down. And then you think about it that way. And of course, there are lots of, at high levels of Magic, I almost think worse because there are a lot of caveats here. You shouldn't make a strategy planned around your opponent doing nothing. That's just bad. But at casual levels of play, and especially in Commander, a many player format, there's this really interesting way in which you can sort of hedge your bets on, how much can people actually stop what I'm doing? Maybe I should just go for it. And there's this kind of wizard poker mentality that I find really fun. How you can program that into your deck more or less is interesting. Lots of other little things. Land is kind of, I think, simultaneously the best and worst part of Magic. Having a lot of the cards in your deck be only to make other cards turn on, like be able to play them, is interesting because it means you have to carefully balance how much you get. It means that you want to consider, what do I do with excess resources, and what do I want to do if I don't have too many resources, and kind of hedging your bets like that and making a balanced strategy that doesn't sacrifice so much in the name of balance as to be toothless, without bite, is really interesting. That balance is really interesting. The way that Magic asks you to carefully consider the pros and cons of your build crafting decisions when you make a deck is, to me, unprecedented. There isn't really another game that asks the same questions of you when you build craft your deck. And there's no game more that I feel like you cannot have it all, so you need to decide what you want, which I think is really cool. I could have spent this whole time talking about Commander and how picking your one commander that is your legendary creature you always have at the beginning of the game, and then you've got 99 other unique cards that you're going to go through, and how you can kind of build around, does the deck have the strategy and the commander is the reliable backup? Is the commander one piece of a two-part combo, and then you have that one piece, but the other stuff is in there? Is the deck built around getting to that other piece or defending those pieces, or a little bit of both, but then it's harder to get them, and maybe you aggressively mulligan to try to find the pieces, and whatever. I think that's really interesting. I didn't focus on that here because I think it's kind of easy. It'd be giving myself an easy way out of discussing what I like about Magic's Buildcraft. But yeah, I hope that was interesting. I really like Magic. I've played it a lot in my life. I have a lot of problems with it, but I do think that it's undeniable that the game is a large percentage of my interest in build craftiness, and it would be wrong not to include it here. Overall, Warframe is the game that became the centerpiece of the beginning of my career for its excellence in Buildcraft in many ways. Hades is the game that inspired me to, yes, I want to move forward and have my career be about exploring Buildcraft in different games. Genshin Impact is sort of the modern push that made me think, wow, there's a lot of games that have a lot of cool stuff to talk about that I am not talking about. I should probably change that. Disco Elysium is a game that inspired me the most of everything that I've played. Risk of Rain 2 is up there as well, but it's kind of because of its non-buildcraft, so I didn't think that counted. That inspired me the most to find a platform where I could talk about games that have interesting buildcraft ideas and kind of do this sort of tourism kind of content that I watch a lot of on YouTube. I don't do speedrunning, but I watch a lot of speedrunning content. And a lot of that content is made for people that do not speedrun. It's not like the person is expecting only speedrunners to watch it. There aren't enough speedrunners. They know that people are going to watch it because they're interested in the topic, even though they aren't going to do it. There's lots of gaming content that is about normally playing the game rather than speedrunning it, that is also kind of touristy, is how I would word it, not in a negative way. And I really like that idea. I think that different kinds of buildcraft tourism can help you learn what you want, and Disco Elysium inspired me to care about that a lot more, because there were a lot of interesting examples. There are a lot of times where most games have some buildcraft, and a surprising number of them have notable buildcraft, even though the game doesn't focus on it that much, which I think is really cool. And finally, Magic is probably the game that should get the credit for getting me interested in this in the first place. That being said, definitely not the only game. A few things I didn't talk about because I'm not equipped to talk about them, but definitely had a big influence on me, or that I remember fondly, are World of Warcraft. I tried to make it have good buildcraft. It doesn't. I don't think it ever really did, but I tried very hard. Guild Wars 2 has good build stuff going on, but is maybe a little bit too crisp, maybe a little... It's not that it's too simple necessarily. The way the game is structured doesn't play up the importance of buildcraft. That's kind of how I feel. That being said, I played Guild Wars 2 to absolute death in college, and it would be wrong not to mention it. Is there anything else that it would just be silly not to... Fake Grand Order has been a really informative counterexample to Genshin Impact for me. I've played a lot of that. There is interesting build stuff to be said there, but a lot of it isn't that interesting buildcrafty stuff. Fake Grand Order has a lot of... I would say a lot of fat in it. Not all of it is the good stuff, and that is a pretty big problem for me. You'll notice that for most of the games I said good things about, one of the main good things I said was most, if not all, of the buildcrafty decisions are good. They're all they're interesting. You're making lots of decisions that are all meaningful. It's not about filling the space you have, even in games like Warframe and to some degree in Hades, where you can have a lot of elements, you still want to choose them carefully. And in games like Magic, they take the extremist approach where not only do you have limited space, but turned up to 11, you want even less space. The game makes you want to really to pack as lightly as possible, in other words, which I think is fascinating. Really draws attention to the individual elements and how they interact and what you can do with individual things. I think that's all I have to say. Mocharaid, thank you so much for being patient. Mocharaid is a new Parley patron that waited easily a month for this answer, and I have a lot to say about it anyway, so I hope that you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun answering it too. It would be interesting to go over... I don't know this, but if I did, it'd be interesting to list every game that I have ever played and think... how many of these have buildcraft that I would be interested to talk about, you know? Because as I was doing this question, and I told you I opened my Steam library, I looked at it and I thought, nah. I mean, I just play video games for fun too, of course. A lot of these games I have not played. A lot of these games I don't have any buildcraft stuff to say about, which is fine. Just to say I thought that was kind of interesting. Thank you very much for asking.